You know what's supposed to be the quietest place in a hospital at 3 a.m.? The empty trauma rooms. So when I started hearing children singing lullabies in rooms that should be silent, I thought I was losing my mind. My name is Rebecca Torres. Last month, I discovered that our pediatric ER was being protected by an army of dead children who died over 90 years ago. They sing lullabies every night between 2 and 4 a.m., not to haunt us, but to keep something much worse away from our living patients. What I learned about those protective spirits changed everything I understood about our hospital, about the vulnerable children we treat, and about the love that can transcend death itself. But I also learned that some things hunt children across centuries, and that sometimes the only thing standing between innocent patients and pure evil is the ghostly voices of children who refuse to let their own suffering be meaningless. This is the story of how I helped an army of dead orphans protect the living, and how I discovered that maternal love doesn't end with death. It just gets stronger. But I need to warn you, what I found in our hospital's hidden history will break your heart before it fills you with hope. Because sometimes the dead don't rest in peace. Sometimes they stand guard. Before I tell you about the night I joined forces with dead children to save a living one, you need to understand who I am and why this story matters. My name is Rebecca Torres, and I'm a pediatric emergency nurse at Children's Memorial Hospital in Philadelphia. I've been working in pediatric emergency medicine for 5 years, specializing in trauma cases involving children from infancy through adolescence. Children's Memorial is one of the premier pediatric hospitals on the East Coast. We handle the most complex cases: childhood cancers, rare genetic disorders, severe trauma, and emergency situations that require the highest level of specialized care. Working with sick and injured children requires a special kind of emotional strength. Every day, I see families facing their worst nightmares, parents watching their children fight for life, kids dealing with pain and fear that no child should ever experience. It's heartbreaking work, but it's also the most meaningful thing I've ever done. There's nothing like helping a child recover, seeing the relief in parents' eyes, being part of the team that gives a family their miracle. Children's Memorial Hospital was built in 1935 as a state-of-the-art facility dedicated exclusively to pediatric care. The building is designed to be as child-friendly as possible. Bright colors, natural light, murals, and artwork that make it feel less clinical and more welcoming. But at night, especially during the quiet hours between 2 and 4 a.m., the hospital takes on a different atmosphere. During these hours, most of our young patients are sleeping. The hallways are dimmed, the playrooms are empty, and the trauma rooms that buzz with activity during the day are silent and still. At least, they're supposed to be silent. 3 weeks ago, during a particularly quiet night shift, I started hearing something that shouldn't have been possible. I was walking past Trauma Room 3, which had been empty since early evening, when I heard the soft sound of a child singing. It was a lullaby. "Hush, little baby," sung in a sweet, clear voice that sounded like it belonged to a girl around 7 or 8 years old. I stopped outside the room and listened carefully. The singing continued for about 30 seconds, then stopped abruptly. I checked the room. It was completely empty. No patients, no family members, no staff. The monitors were turned off, the bed was made, the room was ready for the next patient. But I was certain I had heard a child singing. I asked the other nurses on duty if they had heard anything, but none of them had noticed any unusual sounds. "Maybe it was coming from one of the patient rooms," suggested Maria Santos, a nurse who'd been working at Children's Memorial for 15 years. "Sound carries strangely in this building sometimes." I checked all the patient rooms on our floor. Every child was either sleeping peacefully or awake, but quiet. None of them had been singing. I convinced myself that I had imagined it. Night shifts can play tricks on your mind, especially when you're tired, but the next night it happened again. This time, I heard singing coming from Trauma Room 1. A different voice. A boy, maybe 5 or 6 years old, singing "Rock-a-bye Baby" in a soft, gentle tone. Again, the room was completely empty. Over the following week, the pattern continued. Every night during my shift, between 2 and 4 a.m., I would hear children singing lullabies in empty trauma rooms. Different voices, different songs, but always the same peaceful, comforting tone. And always in rooms that should have been silent. The other nurses on my shift never heard anything. When I mentioned it to Dr. Patricia Williams, our attending physician, she looked concerned. "Rebecca, are you getting enough sleep? Working consecutive night shifts can cause auditory hallucinations. I'm sleeping fine, Dr. Williams, and these aren't random sounds. They're specific songs, sung by what sound like specific children. Have you considered that it might be stress-related? Pediatric emergency medicine can be emotionally draining. I understood Dr. Williams's concern. In medical settings, when someone reports hearing voices that others can't hear, it's usually a sign of psychological distress or medical issues. But I knew what I was hearing wasn't a hallucination. The voices were too clear, too distinct, too purposeful. And I was about to discover that I wasn't the only person who had ever heard children singing in Children's Memorial Hospital, because those voices had been trying to protect our patients for over 90 years, and they were about to need my help to save a child's life. The breakthrough in understanding what I was hearing came during my shift on October 15th. It was an unusually quiet night. We had only 3 patients on the pediatric floor, all of them stable and sleeping. Around 2:30 a.m., I was updating patient charts when I heard the singing again. This time, it was coming from Trauma Room 2, and it wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus of children, maybe 6 or 7 different voices, singing Brahms' Lullaby in perfect harmony. Instead of just listening from the hallway, I decided to enter the room. The moment I opened the door, the singing stopped. But the room wasn't empty. Standing in a circle around the trauma bed were 7 children, ranging in age from about 4 to 12 years old. They were translucent but clearly visible, wearing clothing that looked like it belonged to the early 1900s. The children looked at me with expressions of surprise and curiosity, but not fear. The oldest, a girl with dark hair and a serious expression, stepped forward. "You can see us," she said in a voice that sounded both young and incredibly wise. "Yes," I whispered, trying to process what I was experiencing. "Who are you?" "I'm Margaret," the girl said. "These are my friends. We live here." "Live here? In the hospital?" "We protect the children," said a smaller boy with bright red hair. "The sick children who come here for help." "Protect them from what?" Margaret's expression became very serious. "From the thing that hurt us, the thing that's still here." Before I could ask more questions, the children began to fade. "Wait," I called out. "I want to understand. I want to help." "Tomorrow night," Margaret said as she became increasingly transparent. "Come back tomorrow night and we'll show you." Then they were gone, leaving me alone in the empty trauma room. I spent the rest of my shift trying to make sense of what I had seen. 7 children who claimed to live in the hospital and protect our patients. Children who appeared to be from a much earlier time period. The next morning, I went to the hospital's administrative office and asked to see historical records about the building. What I found explained everything. Children's Memorial Hospital had been built on the site of St. Catherine's Home for Orphan Children, which had operated from 1890 to 1934. According to the records, St. Catherine's had housed over 300 children during its 44 years of operation. The orphanage had been run by the Sisters of Mercy and was considered a model institution for childcare. But in 1934, the orphanage had been closed suddenly following what the records described only as an incident involving multiple child fatalities. I found newspaper articles from 1934 that provided more details. In March 1934, 73 children at St. Catherine's had died within a 2-week period. The official cause was listed as an outbreak of scarlet fever, but the article suggested that negligence and abuse by the orphanage staff had contributed to the deaths. One article mentioned that many of the children had died alone, without comfort or care, and that their bodies had been found in conditions suggesting they had suffered greatly before death. The surviving children from St. Catherine's had been relocated to other institutions, and the building had stood empty for a year before being demolished to make way for the new children's hospital. Reading these articles, I began to understand what Margaret and the other children were. They were the spirits of children who had died at St. Catherine's, and they had remained at the site to protect other children from experiencing the suffering they had endured. But Margaret had mentioned the thing that hurt us, and the thing that's still here. What was still at the hospital that posed a threat to children? That night, I returned to Trauma Room 2 at exactly 2:30 a.m. The 7 children were waiting for me. "You came back," Margaret said with a smile. "You said you would show me what you're protecting the children from." Margaret's expression became grave. "The keeper is still here. He was at the orphanage. And he followed us to this place. Who is the keeper? The man who hurt us, the man who made us suffer, the man who feeds on children's pain and fear. A smaller girl stepped forward. He's not a person anymore. He's something else, something hungry. The keeper looks for children who are alone, who are scared, who are weak, Margaret explained. Sick children in hospitals are perfect for him. What does he do to them? He makes their sickness worse. He makes them more afraid. He feeds on their suffering until they die. I felt ice run through my veins. Are you saying there's something in this hospital that's intentionally harming children? Yes, Margaret said simply, and he's getting stronger. Why haven't you stopped him? We try. That's why we sing. Our songs create protection around the trauma rooms. But we're not strong enough to fight him directly. What would it take to stop him? Margaret looked at the other children, then back at me. Someone living would have to help us. Someone who cares about protecting children. Someone who isn't afraid to fight for them. As she spoke, an alarm began blaring throughout the hospital. Code Blue, pediatric ICU. Code Blue, pediatric ICU. Margaret's eyes went wide with fear. He's found another one, she whispered. A child is dying and the keeper is feeding. Without thinking, I ran out of the trauma room toward the pediatric ICU. As I ran, I could hear the 7 children following me, their voices joining together in a protective chant that I somehow knew was designed to shield the dying child from something much worse than illness. But I was about to discover that some evils are too strong for even the most determined spirits to fight alone. The code blue was for a 6-year-old boy named Tommy Chen, who had been admitted 3 days earlier with pneumonia. When I arrived at the pediatric ICU, the medical team was performing CPR, but Tommy's condition was deteriorating rapidly. Dr. Williams was leading the resuscitation effort, but I could see the confusion in her eyes. His vitals were stable an hour ago, she said to the ICU nurse. This decline doesn't make medical sense. As the medical team worked, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The temperature in Tommy's room was noticeably colder than the rest of the ICU. There was an unpleasant smell in the air, something rotting, decay mixed with fear. And in the corner of the room, barely visible but definitely present, was a tall, thin figure watching the resuscitation with what appeared to be satisfaction. The figure was human-shaped but wrong somehow. Too tall, too angular, with shadows where a face should be. As I watched, the figure seemed to lean closer to Tommy, and the boy's condition worsened. That's when I heard Margaret's voice behind me. That's him. That's the keeper. I turned to see the 7 ghost children standing in the hallway, their translucent forms flickering with what looked like anger and determination. Can you help Tommy? Not while the keeper is feeding, Margaret said. He's too strong when he's actively draining a child. What can we do? We need to break his connection to Tommy, but it requires someone living to disrupt his feeding. How? Get close to Tommy, touch him, show him love and protection. The keeper feeds on fear and isolation. Love and connection weaken him. Without hesitation, I entered Tommy's room. The medical team was focused on their equipment and procedures, so no one questioned my presence. I approached Tommy's bedside and gently took his small hand in mine. The moment I touched him, I felt something horrible, a cold, draining sensation that seemed to be pulling life force out of the child. But I also felt the presence of the 7 ghost children surrounding us, their protective energy flowing through me to Tommy. Tommy, I whispered, you're not alone. You're going to be okay. We're here to protect you. As I spoke, the cold sensation weakened. The rotting smell began to fade, and Tommy's vital signs started to improve. The keeper, the shadowy figure in the corner, became more visible as his feeding was disrupted. I could see hatred and hunger in what passed for his face. But as the ghost children's protective energy grew stronger, the keeper began to retreat. Within 10 minutes, Tommy was breathing steadily on his own. His color returned to normal, and his vital signs stabilized. Dr. Williams looked amazed. I've never seen a turnaround like that. It's like something was preventing him from responding to treatment, and then suddenly that obstruction was removed. After the medical team left Tommy's room, I remained with him for a few more minutes. Margaret appeared beside me. You did it. You saved him. We did it. All of us together. But Rebecca, Margaret said, her expression serious. The keeper isn't gone. He's just retreated. And now he knows you can interfere with his feeding. What does that mean? It means he'll try to stop you. And it means we need to work together to protect all the children in this hospital. Over the following days, I began researching everything I could about St. Catherine's Orphanage and the deaths that had occurred there in 1934. What I found was even more disturbing than I had expected. The newspaper articles from 1934 had understated the true horror of what happened at St. Catherine's. I found a report from a social worker who had investigated the orphanage just before its closure. According to her notes, the children had not died from scarlet fever. They had died from systematic abuse, neglect, and what the social worker described as deliberate cruelty designed to maximize suffering. The orphanage's administrator, a man named Silas Moorcock, had been conducting what he called moral improvement exercises on the children. These exercises involved isolation, starvation, and psychological torture designed to break the children's spirits. Moorcock believed that suffering purified the soul, and he had turned St. Catherine's into a laboratory for inflicting pain on vulnerable children. But the most disturbing discovery was that Moorcock had not been acting alone. According to the social worker's report, Moorcock had been visited regularly by a mysterious figure known only as the benefactor, someone who provided funding for the orphanage in exchange for access to the children. The social worker's notes suggested that this benefactor was not human, but rather something that fed on the children's suffering. When the investigation began closing in on Moorcock and his mysterious partner, 73 children had died in a matter of days, not from disease, but from a final, massive infliction of suffering. Moorcock himself had disappeared, but the benefactor had apparently remained at the site. Reading these historical accounts, I realized that Margaret and her friends were not just the spirits of children who had died at St. Catherine's. They were the spirits of children who had been murdered by a supernatural entity that was still hunting children 90 years later. And that entity, the Keeper, was using Children's Memorial Hospital as its new feeding ground. But I also realized that the ghost children had been successfully protecting our patients for decades. I went back through Children's Memorial's mortality records and found something remarkable. Despite being a major pediatric trauma center that handled the most severe cases, our unexplained death rate was significantly lower than national averages. Children who should have died from their injuries or illnesses were surviving at rates that other hospitals found impossible to explain. Margaret and her friends had been saving lives for 90 years. But according to the historical pattern, the Keeper's power grew stronger over time. And I was about to learn that he was planning something that would overwhelm even the most determined protective spirits. Something that would allow him to feed on every child in the hospital simultaneously. And the only way to stop him would be for me to help the ghost children do something they had never been able to do before. Fight back. My research into the Keeper's patterns revealed something that made me understand why Margaret and the other ghost children were becoming increasingly agitated. Every 90 years, according to historical records I found in the Philadelphia City Archives, there was a mass casualty event involving children in the area where St. Catherine's had stood. 1844, a fire at a boarding school killed 47 children. 1934, the deaths at St. Catherine's Orphanage, 73 children. 2024, we were approaching the 90-year mark. The Keeper wasn't just randomly feeding on individual children anymore. He was building up to something much larger. I shared this information with Margaret during one of our nightly meetings in the trauma rooms. "He's preparing for the great feeding," she confirmed, her young face filled with ancient sadness. "Every 90 years, he gathers enough power to consume many children at once. How many children are we talking about?" "All of them," said a small boy named Timothy. "Every child in the hospital." I felt my heart stop. "When?" "Soon," Margaret said. "We can feel him growing stronger every night, and there are more of his servants now." "Servants?" "Living people who help him in exchange for power. They prepare the way for the great feeding." As Margaret spoke, I realized that some of the unusual deaths and setbacks I'd witnessed recently might not have been medical complications. They might have been sabotage. Over the next few days, I began paying closer attention to the behavior of hospital staff during the night shift. Most of my colleagues were exactly what they appeared to be, dedicated healthcare professionals working to save children's lives. But I noticed that certain staff members exhibited strange patterns. Dr. Marcus Webb, a pediatric surgeon who had recently joined our team, seemed to have an unusually high rate of post-surgical complications among his patients. Nurse Jennifer Costa consistently volunteered for shifts in the pediatric ICU, where the most vulnerable children were treated. And hospital administrator George Flynn had been making unusual changes to security protocols, reducing overnight staffing and limiting access to certain areas of the building. When I mentioned these observations to Margaret, her expression became very serious. "The servants are preparing," she said. "They're weakening the hospital's defenses and making the children more vulnerable." "What can we do?" "We've been protecting individual children for 90 years, Margaret said. "But we've never been strong enough to stop the great feeding. What would it take to stop it?" "A living person would have to help us channel our protective energy into a barrier around the entire hospital, but it would be dangerous." "Dangerous how?" "The keeper would focus all of his power on stopping you, and if you failed, if the barrier broke, you would die and he would consume every child in the hospital." I looked around at the 7 ghost children who had been protecting our patients for nearly a century. "What about you? What would happen to you if we succeeded?" Margaret smiled sadly. "If we stop the great feeding, if we finally defeat the keeper, we can rest. We can move on to whatever comes after." "You mean you would leave?" "Our job would be finished. The children would be safe." I realized that helping the ghost children defeat the keeper would mean losing the protective spirits who had been guarding our hospital for decades. But it would also mean freeing those same spirits from 90 years of vigilant suffering. "When do you think the great feeding will happen?" "Halloween night," said Timothy. "October 31st. The barrier between the living and the dead is thinnest then. It's when he'll be strongest." October the 31st was 5 days away. That night, as I was leaving the hospital at the end of my shift, I encountered Administrator Flynn in the parking garage. "Rebecca!" he called out, approaching me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I understand you've been asking questions about the hospital's history. Just curious about the building we work in." "Curiosity can be dangerous," Flynn said, his smile fading, "especially when it leads people to interfere with things they don't understand." "I'm not sure what you mean." "Some traditions are older than this hospital, Rebecca. Some arrangements have been in place longer than you've been alive. It would be wise not to disrupt them." Flynn's words confirmed what I had suspected. He was one of the keeper's servants. "What happens if I don't agree to stay out of it?" "Then you might find that working here becomes unpleasant. Accidents happen in hospitals. People get sick. Sometimes they don't recover." The threat was clear, but it also told me something important. The keeper and his servants were worried about my interference, which meant that Margaret and the other children were right. A living person could make a difference in this supernatural battle. Over the next 3 days, I prepared for what I knew would be the most important night of my career. I researched everything I could about protective rituals, spiritual barriers, and ways to channel positive energy. I also began documenting everything I had learned about the keeper, his servants, and the ghost children. If something happened to me on Halloween night, I wanted there to be a record of the truth. But most importantly, I spent time with each of the 7 ghost children, learning their names, their stories, and understanding what they had sacrificed to protect the living. Margaret had been 12 when she died, the oldest of a group of siblings who had all died at St. Catherine's. Timothy was only 4, and he had been at the orphanage his entire short life. Sarah was 7 and had been placed at St. Catherine's after her parents died in a factory fire. Each of them had endured unimaginable suffering before death, but instead of being consumed by anger or despair, they had chosen to use their existence to protect other children. They were the most heroic people I had ever met. And on Halloween night, I was going to help them finally find peace. But first, we had to save every child in Children's Memorial Hospital from a supernatural predator who had been feeding on children for over a century. And we had to do it while fighting against hospital staff members who were actively working to help the keeper succeed. As October 31st approached, I could feel the supernatural tension building in the hospital. The ghost children were becoming more visible, even during daylight hours. The temperature throughout the building was dropping, and I was beginning to sense a malevolent presence that seemed to be watching our every move. The keeper knew we were planning to stop him, and he was preparing for war. On October 30th, the night before Halloween, I arrived at work to find the hospital in chaos. 3 children in the pediatric ICU had taken sudden, inexplicable turns for the worse. Their conditions had deteriorated so rapidly that the medical staff was scrambling to understand what was happening. But I knew exactly what was happening. The keeper was starting the great feeding early, building up power for the main event. As I checked on the affected children, I could see the shadowy figure moving from room to room, growing more solid and more powerful with each child he drained. Margaret and the other ghost children were trying to protect the patients, but their efforts were being overwhelmed by the keeper's increasing strength. "He's too strong tonight," Margaret told me as we met in Trauma Room 2. "We can't maintain the protective barriers around individual children much longer." "What about the hospital-wide barrier we discussed?" "It's our only chance. But Rebecca, if we attempt it tonight and fail, we won't have enough strength left to protect anyone tomorrow night." I realized we were facing an impossible choice. Attempt the barrier tonight when our chances of success were lower, or wait until tomorrow night when the keeper would be at maximum power, but when failure would mean the deaths of every child in the hospital. Before I could decide, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Stop interfering or the children will suffer even more than planned. A friend." The message was clearly from one of the keeper's servants, but it also told me something important. They were worried about our plans, which meant our plans might actually work. I was about to respond to the message when I heard screaming from the pediatric ICU. I ran to find Dr. Webb standing over a 7-year-old patient named Emma Rodriguez. Emma had been admitted with appendicitis and should have been recovering normally, but Dr. Webb was injecting something into her IV line that definitely wasn't part of her prescribed treatment. "Dr. Webb, what are you giving her?" Dr. Webb turned to me with eyes that seemed to reflect light like an animal's. "Something to make her more receptive to the keeper's attention," he said in a voice that sounded wrong, distorted. I immediately hit the call button for security and tried to stop Dr. Webb from completing the injection. But as I grabbed his arm, I felt something that made my blood freeze. Dr. Webb's skin was ice cold, and underneath his human appearance, I could sense something dark and hungry. He wasn't just a servant of the keeper, he was a vessel. The keeper was using Dr. Webb's body to directly harm children. As we struggled over the syringe, I heard Margaret's voice behind me. "Rebecca, get away from him! He's not human anymore!" But I couldn't leave Emma to be poisoned by whatever Dr. Webb was trying to inject. That's when the other 6 ghost children appeared around Emma's bed. Together, they created a barrier of protective energy that made Dr. Webb recoil as if he'd been burned. "You cannot have this child," Margaret said with authority that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her apparent age. Dr. Webb's face contorted with rage, and when he spoke, his voice was the sound of grinding stone and whispered threats. "The great feeding will happen tomorrow night whether you interfere or not, and now, because of your meddling, it will be even more painful for the children." With those words, Dr. Webb collapsed to the floor, unconscious. Security arrived moments later, and Dr. Webb was taken to the adult emergency department for evaluation. But I knew that whatever had been controlling him was gone, probably transferred to another host. Emma's condition stabilized quickly once the ghost children's protection was in place. But the encounter with the possessed Dr. Webb had shown me how dangerous our opponents really were. They weren't just hospital staff members who had made deals with a supernatural entity. They were people who had been completely taken over by the keeper's influence, and there were probably more of them throughout the hospital. That night, I called a meeting with all 7 ghost children. "We can't wait until tomorrow night," I told them. "The keeper is getting stronger every hour, and he's taking control of more staff members. If we don't act tonight, we might not get another chance." Margaret nodded grimly. "We agree. But Rebecca, you need to understand what you're risking. Tell me, to create a barrier around the entire hospital, you'll need to channel our protective energy through your living body. That much spiritual energy could kill you. And if the barrier fails, the keeper will focus all of his power on destroying you first, then feeding on every child in the hospital. The deaths will be slower and more painful than if we did nothing." I looked around at the 7 brave spirits who had been protecting children for 90 years. "What are the chances of success?" Timothy, the youngest, spoke up. Better than if we wait, but still not good. How not good? Margaret answered honestly. Maybe one chance in 3. I thought about Emma Rodriguez, about Tommy Chen, about all the children currently sleeping in the hospital who had no idea they were being hunted by something that fed on suffering. I thought about the 73 children who had died at St. Catherine's Orphanage because no one had been able to protect them. And I thought about the hundreds of children who had been saved over the past 90 years because 7 brave spirits had refused to let their own deaths be meaningless. What do I need to do? Margaret smiled, the first truly happy expression I had seen from her. We need to go to the place where it all started, the basement level, directly below where the orphanage dormitory used to be. What's down there now? Storage rooms and old equipment. But it's also where the keeper is strongest because it's where we died. And where we'll make our final stand, added Sarah. As we prepared to descend to the basement level of Children's Memorial Hospital, I realized that I was about to participate in a battle that had been 90 years in the making. 7 children who had died in agony had spent nearly a century protecting other children from the entity that had killed them. And now, with my help, they were finally going to fight back. But first, we had to survive a direct confrontation with something that had been feeding on children's suffering for over a century. Something that was now at its strongest. Something that would do absolutely anything to prevent us from stopping the great feeding. As we headed toward the basement, I could feel the keeper's attention focusing on us. The temperature dropped even further. The lights began to flicker. And somewhere in the darkness below, something ancient and hungry was preparing to defend its feeding ground. But for the first time in 90 years, it was going to face opposition from someone who could fight it on its own terms. Someone who was still alive, and who carried the protective love of 7 children who had refused to let evil win. The final battle was about to begin. The basement level of Children's Memorial Hospital felt like descending into a tomb. The moment we stepped off the elevator, the temperature plummeted, and I could smell something that made my stomach turn, the scent of fear, suffering, and decay that had been accumulating for over 90 years. Margaret and the other 6 ghost children became more solid as we descended, their translucent forms gaining definition and strength. This is where it happened, Margaret said, leading us down a corridor lined with storage rooms. This is where the dormitory was, where we slept, where we died. As we walked, I could hear sounds that shouldn't have been possible, the echo of children crying, the sound of footsteps from decades past, voices whispering in fear and pain. The basement holds memories, explained Timothy. Everything that happened here is still happening, just in a different time. At the end of the corridor, we reached a large storage room that felt different from the others. The air was thick with supernatural energy, and I could sense that this space was significant. This was the dormitory, Margaret said, where all 73 children slept, where the keeper came to feed on us night after night before finally killing us all. As she spoke, the room began to change around us. The modern storage equipment faded, replaced by rows of small, thin beds. The concrete walls became old wood paneling. The fluorescent lights dimmed to the weak glow of gas lamps. We were seeing St. Catherine's Orphanage as it had been in 1934. And standing at the far end of the room was the keeper. He was no longer the shadowy figure I had glimpsed in patient rooms. Here, in the place of his greatest power, he was fully manifest. He appeared as a tall, gaunt man in a dark suit, but there was something fundamentally wrong with his proportions. His limbs were too long, his face too angular, his eyes too deep and dark. When he spoke, his voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Welcome to my feeding ground," he said, looking directly at me. "I am impressed that a living human has made it this far, but your interference ends here. We're here to stop the great feeding," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the terror I felt. The keeper laughed, a sound like breaking glass and children's screams. "You think 7 dead children and 1 misguided nurse can stand against power that has been accumulating for a century? I have fed on thousands of children across the decades. Their suffering has made me stronger than you can imagine." As he spoke, the room filled with shadows that moved independently, reaching toward us with grasping tendrils. Margaret stepped forward, her young voice filled with incredible strength. "We may be dead, but we are not powerless. For 90 years, We have protected the innocent. Tonight, we fight back." The 7 ghost children joined hands, forming a circle around me. As their connection strengthened, I could feel their combined protective energy flowing through the room. The advancing shadows recoiled from the light that began emanating from the children. "Rebecca," Margaret said, "place your hands on our circle. Channel our energy through your living spirit and extend it throughout the hospital." I placed my hands on Margaret's and Timothy's shoulders, completing the circle. The moment my hands touched them, I felt an incredible surge of power flow through me. But it wasn't just energy, it was love. The pure, protective love that these 7 children felt for every innocent child who had ever needed protection. The love they had maintained for 90 years despite their own suffering. The love that had motivated them to stand guard over sleeping children night after night, decade after decade. As this overwhelming emotion flowed through me, I understood what we needed to do. "Extend the protection," I said, visualizing a barrier of light spreading out from our circle. Together, we began to push the protective energy beyond the basement, up through the floors of the hospital, surrounding every room where children lay sleeping. The keeper roared with rage as he felt his influence being blocked. "You cannot maintain this!" he shrieked. "Living flesh cannot channel that much spiritual energy without burning out." He was right. I could feel the protective energy burning through me like fire. My body wasn't designed to handle the combined spiritual power of 7 protective spirits. But as the pain increased, I thought about every child in the hospital above us. Emma Rodriguez, recovering from her appendectomy. Tommy Chen, sleeping peacefully after his pneumonia crisis. Dozens of other children who deserve to grow up, to have families, to experience joy instead of the terror and suffering the keeper wanted to feed them. The pain was unbearable, but the love was stronger. "He's right," Margaret said, her voice filled with anguish. "Rebecca, this is killing you." "Then we finish it quickly," I gasped. Instead of just maintaining the protective barrier, I pushed all of our combined energy directly at the keeper. The blast of purified love and protective intention hit him like a physical force. For the first time in over a century, the keeper staggered backward. "Impossible," he hissed. Living humans can do anything when they're protecting children," I said. The 7 ghost children began to glow brighter, their forms becoming more solid and powerful than I had ever seen them. "We are not just the children who died here," Margaret declared. "We are the representatives of every child who has ever suffered, every child who has ever needed protection, every child who has ever deserved love." As she spoke, the room filled with additional figures. Hundreds of other children, spirits of kids who had died throughout history, all drawn to this moment of confrontation between protective love and predatory evil. The keeper was now facing not just 7 orphans from St. Catherine's, but an army of children who had chosen to stand against the kind of evil that had taken their lives. "This ends now," I said, pouring every ounce of protective energy I could channel directly at the keeper. The combined spiritual force of hundreds of protective child spirits, focused through my living will, hit the keeper with the power of a century's worth of accumulated love. The keeper's form began to dissolve, his screams of rage and pain echoing through dimensions. "You have not destroyed me," he shrieked as he faded. "I am eternal. I will return." "Not here," Margaret said with quiet finality. "Never here again." As the keeper's presence completely vanished, I felt the protective barrier we had created solidify around the entire hospital. But I also felt my own life force burning away. Channeling that much spiritual energy through a living body had pushed me beyond my physical limits. I collapsed to the floor, my vision blurring as my heart struggled to continue beating. "Rebecca," Margaret said, kneeling beside me, "you saved them all." Are you all free now?" I whispered. "Yes," she said with a smile of infinite peace. "Our work is finished. The children are safe. What happens to you now?" "We go home. We finally get to rest." One by one, the 7 children came to say goodbye. Timothy hugged me with arms that felt warm and real. Sarah whispered, "Thank you," in a voice filled with joy. Each of them touched my hand, and with each touch, I felt some of my life force returning. They were giving back some of the energy I had shared with them. Margaret was the last to say goodbye. "Rebecca, the hospital is protected now. No supernatural entity will ever be able to harm children here again. But more than that, the love we've shared tonight will spread. Other hospitals, other places where children need protection will be blessed by what we've done here. Will I ever see you again? When your time comes, we'll be waiting. But that won't be for many, many years. You have more children to protect, more love to share. With those words, Margaret and the other 6 children began to fade into a warm, golden light. But before they disappeared completely, I heard their voices one more time, singing together. "Hush, little baby, don't say a word. Mama's gonna buy you a mockingbird." The lullaby filled the basement, rose through the floors of the hospital, and settled over every sleeping child like a protective blanket. Then they were gone, and I was alone in the storage room. But I wasn't really alone. I could feel the presence of their love throughout the hospital, woven into the very structure of the building. Children's Memorial Hospital had become something more than a medical facility. It had become a sanctuary, blessed by the sacrifice of 7 children who had turned their own suffering into protection for others. As I made my way back to the elevator, I felt the weight of what we had accomplished. The great feeding had been prevented. The keeper had been defeated. And every child in the hospital was safe. But I also felt the weight of responsibility. Margaret had said that the love we had shared would spread to other places where children needed protection, which meant my work was just beginning. When I returned to the main hospital from the basement, everything had changed. The oppressive atmosphere that had been building for weeks was completely gone. The air felt lighter, warmer, filled with a sense of peace and protection. I checked on every child on the pediatric floors, and what I found was remarkable. Tommy Chen, who had been struggling with pneumonia complications, was breathing easily and showing rapid improvement. Emma Rodriguez was awake and asking for her parents, her recovery progressing faster than anyone had expected. Throughout the hospital, children who had been critically ill were showing sudden, dramatic improvements in their conditions. The protective energy that Margaret and the other children had left behind wasn't just keeping supernatural threats away, it was actively promoting healing. Dr. Williams found me in the pediatric ICU around 6 a.m. "Rebecca, I don't know what happened tonight, but we've had more positive turnarounds in the past few hours than I've seen in years of practice." "Sometimes children are more resilient than we expect," I said. "This is beyond resilience. It's like something changed in the fundamental atmosphere of the hospital. The children seem calmer, less afraid, more responsive to treatment." Dr. Williams was right. Over the following days and weeks, Children's Memorial Hospital experienced a dramatic transformation. Our patient outcomes improved across every metric. Children recovered faster, experienced fewer complications, and seemed less anxious about their medical treatments. Families commented on how peaceful and welcoming the hospital felt. Medical staff found themselves more energized, more compassionate, more effective in their work. But perhaps most importantly, we never again experienced unexplained deaths or sudden deteriorations that couldn't be medically explained. The hospital had become what it was always meant to be, a place of genuine healing and protection for children. 3 months after Halloween night, I was approached by Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a psychiatrist who specialized in working with children who had experienced trauma. "Rebecca, I wanted to thank you for whatever you did to change the atmosphere in this hospital." "I'm not sure what you mean." "The children I work with, kids who have experienced abuse, neglect, violence, they all comment on how safe they feel here now. They say the hospital itself makes them feel protected." Dr. Rodriguez showed me drawings that some of her young patients had made. The drawings depicted Children's Memorial Hospital surrounded by figures that looked remarkably like Margaret and her 6 friends. "They keep drawing these protective figures," Dr. Rodriguez explained. "When I ask them about it, they say they're the guardian angels who watch over the hospital." I smiled, knowing that Margaret and her friends had found a way to let their presence be felt, even after moving on to whatever comes after life. But the changes weren't limited to Children's Memorial Hospital. Over the following year, I began hearing reports from other pediatric hospitals around the country. Facilities that had been experiencing unexplained problems, unusual mortality rates, staff burnout, children who seemed inexplicably fearful, were suddenly reporting dramatic improvements. It was as if the protective energy we had channeled on Halloween night was spreading, creating a network of supernatural protection around vulnerable children everywhere. Margaret had been right. The love we had shared that night was growing, reaching other places where children needed protection. But my personal journey was just beginning. 6 months after the confrontation with the keeper, I started having dreams. In these dreams, I would see other hospitals, other places where children were in danger. Sometimes the threats were supernatural, like the keeper, but sometimes they were very human. Abusive staff members, negligent administrators, people who were harming children in medical settings. In each dream, I would see children who needed protection, and I would feel the same calling I had felt when working with Margaret and her friends. I realized that my encounter with the 7 protective spirits had changed me in fundamental ways. I had developed a sensitivity to children in danger, an ability to sense when young patients needed protection that went beyond medical care. I began traveling to other hospitals as a consultant, officially helping to improve pediatric care protocols, but unofficially serving as a guardian for vulnerable children. Sometimes my work involved exposing staff members who were abusing patients. Sometimes it meant identifying supernatural threats that were harming children. And sometimes it simply meant being present to provide the love and protection that a frightened child needed. In each case, I carried with me the lessons I had learned from 7 brave spirits who had turned their own suffering into protection for others. 2 years after Halloween night, I returned to Children's Memorial Hospital for a special ceremony. The hospital was dedicating a memorial garden to the children who had died at St. Catherine's Orphanage. The garden featured 7 small trees, each planted in honor of Margaret, Timothy, Sarah, and their 4 friends. At the center of the garden was a plaque that read, "In memory of the children of St. Catherine's Orphanage, who taught us that love transcends death, that protection is the highest calling, and that the innocent deserve to be safe. Their spirits watch over this place and all the children it serves." As I stood in the memorial garden, I felt a familiar warmth, the presence of the 7 protective spirits, no longer bound to earth, but still watching over the children they had spent 90 years protecting. And I heard, very faintly, the sound of children singing lullabies. But these weren't the voices of trapped spirits crying out for justice. These were the voices of free souls, singing songs of peace and protection for all the living children who would pass through Children's Memorial Hospital. Margaret and her friends had found their eternal rest, but their legacy of protective love would continue forever. Today, I work as a national consultant on pediatric hospital safety. My official job is to help medical facilities improve their patient care protocols and safety standards. My unofficial job is to serve as a guardian for children who need protection that goes beyond medicine. I have learned that there are many hospitals like the old Children's Memorial, places where supernatural forces threaten vulnerable patients. But I've also learned that there are always protective spirits willing to stand guard. Sometimes they're the spirits of children who died tragically, like Margaret and her friends. Sometimes they're the spirits of healthcare workers who dedicated their lives to protecting patients. And sometimes they're the spirits of family members who refuse to let their loved ones face danger alone. The key is recognizing their presence and learning how to work with them. Every hospital, every medical facility has the potential to become a sanctuary of healing and protection. It just requires people who are willing to listen to the voices of those who have gone before, to honor the spirits who stand guard, and to remember that protecting children is the most sacred work anyone can do. If you work in healthcare, especially with children, remember Margaret's story. Remember that protective love doesn't end with death. Remember that spirits of the innocent often return to guard the vulnerable. And remember that sometimes the strange sounds you hear in empty hospital rooms aren't signs of haunting, they're signs of protection. The next time you hear children singing lullabies in places where no children should be, don't be afraid. Listen carefully. Those voices might be trying to tell you that somewhere nearby a child needs protection, and if you're brave enough, if you're loving enough, you might be able to help provide it. Margaret and her 6 friends taught me that the most powerful force in the universe isn't medical technology or pharmaceutical intervention. It's love. Protective, selfless, transcendent love that refuses to let the innocent suffer. That love can cross the boundary between life and death. It can turn suffering into strength, and it can transform even the most tragic circumstances into opportunities for heroism. Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Timothy, Sarah, and all your friends. Thank you for showing me that protecting children is the highest calling. Thank you for teaching me that love never dies. And thank you for proving that sometimes the dead don't rest in peace because they're too busy keeping the living safe. Sweet dreams, brave spirits. Your work is done, but your love lives on forever.